A horrifying night in Beverly Hills. Two bodies lie in pools of blood, and two sons become the center of one of the most shocking cases in American history. Are they cold-blooded killers or victims of a private hell hidden behind wealth and luxury? Truth is distorted and justice hangs in a fragile moral balance. Will you judge or forgive? Watch the full haunting story now. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button to access exclusive videos, in-depth breakdowns, and special content just for you. That night, the skies over Beverly Hills were clear, but within the luxurious neighborhood of Calvert Drive, a nightmare quietly unfolded. The lights in the Menendez mansion flickered dimly, as if the house itself was trying to hide a terrible secret. At exactly 11 p.m., a panicked 911 call jolted the emergency dispatch. The voice of a young man on the other end cracked with terror, gasping between frantic breaths. "My parents have been shot. They're dead." Beverly Hills police immediately dispatched patrol units to the scene. No one expected that behind the half-open iron gate stood the beginning of one of the most brutal and controversial cases in American criminal history. The mansion sat nestled among California's most expensive real estate home to movie stars, tech billionaires, and entertainment moguls. When officers arrived, they were met by two distraught young men. The air inside was heavy with the scent of gunpowder. In the living room, even the most seasoned investigators froze. Jose Menendez, media executive and former CEO of RCA, lay lifeless on the couch, riddled with bullets through his chest and head. Beside him, his wife Kitty was sprawled on the floor, her body mutilated blood soaking the white carpet beneath her. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. No one heard screams. Everything was unnervingly silent, as if the murders had taken place in a sealed world, leaving no echo beyond the walls. The police quickly sealed off the crime scene, called in forensics, and began autopsy procedures. Meanwhile, the Menendez brothers, Lyle and Eric, remained huddled together on the floor backs against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. A young officer approached gently, trying to get a coherent story, but only received fragmented answers, shattered memories, trapped in panic. By morning, the news had spread like wildfire. The murder of Jose and Kitty Menendez dominated front pages across the nation. Americans were glued to their televisions, watching every development of what reporters had begun calling the Beverly Hills murders, a name both chilling and glamorous fitting for a crime that took place in the heart of privilege. To the public, Jose and Kitty were the epitome of the American dream. He was a Cuban immigrant who built an empire from nothing, climbing to the top of the entertainment industry. She was a devoted wife and former teacher who poured her life into raising their two sons. They lived in a multi-million-dollar mansion, drove luxury cars, and sent their boys to elite private schools. No enemies, no debts, no warning signs. And yet here they were, executed in their own home. It was that very perfection that made investigators uneasy. Why would a wealthy, powerful, scandal-free family be the target of such a savage attack? Why wasn't anything stolen? And most critically, what was being hidden beneath the polished surface of this seemingly flawless household? Outside the mansion, camera flashes exploded in rapid bursts. News crews broadcast live updates as forensic teams entered and exited the scene. Curious neighbors huddled behind police lines, whispering theories, feeding rumors. A targeted killing in Beverly Hills, a place where money was supposed to buy safety, had shaken the illusion of security to its core. That night, under the warm glow of street lamps, amid the tense whispers of affluent residents and the furrowed brows of homicide detectives, one thing became certain: the tragedy wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next morning, as sunlight tilted over Calvert Drive, the bloodstains inside the Menendez mansion had yet to dry. Police officers, journalists, and forensic specialists moved in and out like clockwork. But the center of attention was no longer the lifeless bodies of Jose and Kitty. It had shifted to two young men who overnight had gone from grieving sons to the focus of a nation. Lyle Menendez, 21 years old with a sharp jawline and neatly combed hair, had been a student at Princeton. His younger brother, Eric, 18 softer and more reserved was a recent high school graduate and star of the tennis team. They were the ones who found their parents' bodies and made the 911 call. Described by neighbors as polite, well-behaved, and quiet, the brothers had rarely drawn attention in their wealthy enclave. And it was precisely this image of good boys that made the tragedy all the more baffling. The media exploded with speculation. Was this a brutal act of revenge by organized crime? Whispers suggested that the killings had all the markings of a mob hit. Jose Menendez had once held a powerful executive role at RCA, one of the largest music companies in the country during the 1980s, deeply entangled with the Latin entertainment industry, and some believed with underground networks in New York. That theory shot to the top of the investigative list. Detectives combed through Jose's recent business dealings, especially his ties in Miami and New Jersey. Rumors swirled of a multi-million-dollar distribution deal that Jose had controlled, one that had sparked threats and rivalries. Inside sources hinted that Jose had made enemies by cutting off contracts and asserting dominance when things didn't go his way. The press dove headfirst into the Menendez family's background. Old stories about Kitty surfaced, how she had once been a quiet English teacher in Illinois, how she may have struggled silently under the pressure of her husband's ambition and dominance. Was their marriage truly picture-perfect? Or had the public been fooled by a carefully maintained facade? But just as all eyes turned to external enemies, something felt off. First, there was the behavior of the two sons. They weren't acting like boys who had just lost their parents. Lyle gave interviews with a calmness that unsettled viewers. Eric, though, more withdrawn, was spotted shopping for designer clothes and browsing luxury car showrooms. Both brothers had hired separate attorneys within days of the funeral, a rare move for grieving children, unless there was a looming threat. Some officers in the investigation began to whisper doubts. Revenge killings usually leave trails, threatening letters, surveillance footage, a discarded weapon. But here, there was nothing. The killer had entered and exited like a ghost, leaving no signs of forced entry, no struggle. Every move had been precise, calculated, as if the person responsible knew the layout of the house and the victims. Criminal profilers were brought in. An FBI expert reviewed the scene and filed a brief but chilling conclusion. The perpetrator likely lived in the home. Everything changed. The investigation pivoted. No longer focused on business rivals or shadowy criminals, the attention turned inward. The two young men, once witnesses, were quietly becoming suspects. But the detectives knew if this truly was a case of patricide, it wouldn't be about greed alone. Something darker had to be hiding behind those mansion walls, a secret so well kept, so deeply buried that it had survived in silence for years. And that was when the case took a turn. No one expected. Just days after the hasty funeral of Jose and Kitty Menendez, while relatives were still reeling with grief, their two sons, Lyle and Eric, began a new chapter. It was a chapter not marked by mourning, but by spending sprees and lavish indulgence. As if someone had lifted an invisible weight from their shoulders, the brothers dove headfirst into a lifestyle soaked in luxury. Lyle, the older brother at 21, began investing in real estate in New Jersey, one of the hottest markets at the time. He didn't just purchase a high-end condo, he also bought a restaurant franchise, hired a management team, and signed off on all ownership rights. Eric, instead of returning to school, spent his time traveling, buying a Rolex, luxury cars, and designer clothes. Together, they shopped freely, charged thousands to their parents' old credit cards, and burned through tens of thousands of dollars in the first few weeks after the murders. Meanwhile, the public watched the story unfold with sympathy. Two young men who had just lost their parents in the most brutal way imaginable. But that sympathy quickly began to fracture as the media took note of strange behavior, especially the way the brothers carried themselves in public. In one rare interview, Lyle read aloud a letter he had written to honor his father. It spoke of walking in his father's shoes to learn how to be a strong man. But what chilled viewers wasn't the content of the letter, it was his delivery. He smiled gently as he read, a kind of smile that didn't belong to grief. There were no tears, no tremble in his voice, just a calm, practiced tone as if he was performing a monologue from a well-rehearsed script. Eric, for his part, stayed largely out of the public eye, but credit card statements, bank records, and store security footage told another story. He was spending freely designer clothing trips to Las Vegas, luxury hotel stays, even thousands on car modifications. These weren't the actions of a teenager crushed by trauma. They were the actions of someone reveling in newfound freedom. Relatives of Kitty Menendez began to speak out. They described a funeral that felt hollow. There were no candles, no solemn music, no heartfelt eulogies, just a cold, tightly controlled event. Lyle managed everything, like a business meeting, directing guests, organizing logistics, keeping everything under control. There were no emotional breakdowns, no tearful embraces, just coordination and order, as though he were hosting a formal gathering rather than saying goodbye to his parents. The police, though still quiet in the public eye, had begun to take note. In private briefings, investigators were marking down the strange details. One officer who had worked the crime scene wrote in his report, "They cried without tears, no swelling around the eyes, no redness, but always holding tissues." It was subtle, but to seasoned investigators, artificial grief was something you couldn't fake forever. The emotional detachment of the Menendez brothers raised a chilling question. Were they hiding something? Or worse, were they the cause of the tragedy? And if so, what could have fractured a seemingly perfect family so deeply that the sons would turn against the very people who gave them life? The more closely the public looked, the more cracks they saw beneath the polished image of the Menendez household. A tragedy that didn't seem to bleed a performance that felt rushed, and two young men with hollow eyes not reflecting sorrow, but emptiness, and the shadow of money flowing faster than grief. 6 months had passed since that fateful night, when blood soaked the white carpet of the Menendez mansion, and the names Lyle and Eric still lingered in a gray zone between sympathy and suspicion. Police had no concrete evidence to make an arrest, and the public had grown restless watching a case that seemed to be slipping into dead ends. Then, like a bomb detonating in still waters, a confession emerged, not from a suspect, not from the police, but from someone on the outside. The girlfriend of a therapist. This young woman, whose identity was protected for legal reasons, came to the police in a state of nervous urgency. In her possession was a stunning revelation. Eric Menendez had confessed to killing his parents during a private therapy session. Not in vague dreams, not as a hypothetical scenario. A real detailed confession spoken with intention. And more than that, the confession had been recorded secretly and cautiously by the therapist himself. It was the one piece of evidence police had been desperately lacking, a puzzle piece they didn't even dare to hope for. Investigators quickly secured a warrant to seize the tape. On the recording, Eric's voice was soft, quivering between fear and a strange sense of relief. He spoke of the night of the murders, of how he and Lyle had bought guns, planned the act, and carried it out. The details matched the crime scene eerily well, fitting into gaps investigators hadn't yet been able to fill. There was no turning back. On March 8, 1990, both Lyle and Eric Menendez were arrested. It wasn't a dramatic manhunt or a televised takedown. It was quiet. Lyle was taken into custody at Princeton University. Eric, who had traveled to Israel to get away from media scrutiny, was summoned back and arrested on arrival. The world believed the case was finally closed. The killers were in custody. Justice would be served, but no one realized that this was only the beginning. Because once the confession was clear, and the perpetrators named, the real shock was no longer who killed Jose and Kitty Menendez. It became, why did they do it? Was it greed? A cold-blooded plan to inherit a fortune by two spoiled rich kids? Or was it something deeper, something darker, something hiding beneath the polished surface of a seemingly perfect home? Defense attorneys were appointed. The media surged back with a new wave of attention, and the public found itself split down. The middle one half was outraged, calling it a brutal crime, the tragic result of wealth and entitlement gone unchecked. The other half grew uneasy. Because if there truly was a reason why two sons would raise guns and shoot their own parents, then it couldn't be a simple one. Behind the stone walls of the Menendez estate, beneath the elegant dinner's designer clothes and elite tuition, had there been a hidden hell. From that moment on, the Menendez case entered a new phase. Not just a criminal investigation, but a psychological reckoning. A descent into the hidden traumas of a family that looked perfect on the outside. It was no longer just a murder story. It became a chilling mirror held up to society, forcing it to ask a far more terrifying question. How many children are growing up in silence and in fear? At the first trial, inside a cold courtroom bathed in harsh white light, the truth began to seep out, not from the lawyers, but from the mouths of the very brothers accused of murdering their parents. Lyle and Eric Menendez, seated across from the jury, testified that they had been sexually abused for years by their father, Jose Menendez. Their words came out in fragments, sometimes angry, mostly afraid. And Kitty, the mother, once seen as nurturing and devoted, was accused of knowing everything and doing nothing. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew suffocating. What began as a murder trial was now transforming into a harrowing account of domestic abuse. The image of the two young men, once portrayed as cold-blooded and greedy, shifted. They now appeared broken, wounded, scarred by a childhood steeped in silence and fear. Eric recounted the nights when his father would sneak into his room, the unbearable silence he kept for fear the neighbors might hear. He described begging his mother to intervene only for her to respond, "Don't make your father angry." Lyle, more composed, didn't describe the abuse in detail, but confirmed that both brothers had lived under the same suffocating control. Immediately, the courtroom and the country exploded with controversy. The media split in two. One side accused the brothers of emotional manipulation, calling it a defense strategy, scripted to soften the blow of an unforgivable crime. The other side paused and wondered, what if it was true? What if behind the mansion gates, beneath the luxury and appearances, a quiet terror had grown unchecked for years? The trial became a battleground between reason and emotion, law and morality. Some jurors were visibly shaken when the court presented a handwritten letter from Eric to his cousin Andy Kano. In it, Eric wrote about things my father does to my body. I can't sleep. The letter was dated nearly a year before the murders, one of the first signs that Eric's story may not have been invented after the fact. Testimony wasn't limited to the brothers. Relatives were called to the stand, and it was their words unplanned, almost casual, that shook the courtroom. An aunt stood up and said, "We saw something strange. The way Jose hugged his sons, how they shrank when he entered the room. But we told ourselves we were overthinking. Now I wish I had said something." Evidence came not just in words, but in glances, in memories long buried within a family. And as those memories resurfaced like mud stirred up by a storm, the Menendez case ceased to be just a murder story. It became a warning, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things don't lurk outside. They live behind closed doors, where we are taught to believe family is the safest place of all, and they believed it with absolute certainty. 2 days before the killings, Lyle and Eric visited a gun store in San Diego. Using fake IDs, they purchased 2 12-gauge shotguns and a substantial amount of ammunition. They offered no clear reason. They left no written plan. But according to their testimony, the guns were not bought for murder. They were bought for protection. In their minds, death was approaching, and the ones bringing it, their own parents. That night, Jose and Kitty sat in the family room, watching TV and enjoying dessert, a quiet, ordinary moment. But for the brothers, it was the moment of no return. With the television blaring, they entered from behind, each holding a shotgun. Eric recalled that he froze for a second when he saw his father. But then the memories flooded back, the years of abuse, the invisible wounds, and the fear of being discarded like damaged goods. He pulled the trigger. The first shot struck Jose. He was killed almost instantly. Kitty, sitting beside him, leapt up in panic and ran toward the hallway, but before she could flee the room, more shots rang out. According to the medical examiner, she didn't die immediately. She collapsed, gasping for air, calling out her son's names. At that moment, Lyle approached, reloaded his weapon, and fired 2 more rounds into his mother's head. A final act that chilled the nation calculated brutality or total loss of control. That question still hangs in the air. The defense claimed it was the result of long-term psychological trauma, 2 boys raised in silence and fear, abused and ignored, driven to a breaking point. Reloading the gun, they argued, wasn't a sign of composure. It was panic, a mental blackout where fear overwhelmed reason. The prosecution disagreed. They pointed to the gun purchase, the timing, the fact that the brothers waited until their parents were home and ensured no witnesses were present. They argued this was not fear, it was planning. They claimed Lyle and Eric were not acting out of desperation, but had long since decided to kill. Reloading wasn't panic, it was resolve. Once again, the public was divided. Some said if their parents truly planned to kill them, then this was self-defense. Others countered, then why not run? Why not tell someone? Why kill and kill so thoroughly? Whether through sympathy or condemnation, that night marked a point of no return. It wasn't just the end of Jose and Kitty Menendez's lives. It was the climax of a slow-burning tragedy. Years of unspoken pain, guilt, and fear had led to a single explosive act, an act that even years later the brothers themselves would struggle to fully understand. In July 1993, nearly 4 years after the brutal murders that shocked Beverly Hills, the trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez officially began. The Los Angeles courtroom became the focal point of national attention. Every eye was fixed on the 2 young men accused of cold-bloodedly killing their parents. But this trial wasn't just about a crime, it was about a motive. And more than that, it was about the fragile boundary between fear and premeditated violence. The defense introduced a legal argument rarely seen in patricide cases: imperfect self-defense. They didn't deny that Lyle and Eric had killed their parents. Instead, they argued the murders were not driven by greed or hatred, but by a sincere belief that their lives were in danger. The brothers, the defense claimed, were raised in an environment of abuse and psychological terror, robbed of the ability to trust anyone, and eventually broke under the weight of years of trauma. Their goal wasn't total exoneration, but understanding. They wanted the jury to see that this wasn't a typical crime. It was a reaction born from deep emotional wounds, silence, and the absence of intervention when they needed it most. The prosecution painted a starkly different picture. They described Lyle and Eric as spoiled, privileged sons of millionaire parents living in a mansion, attending elite schools, who gunned down their parents to inherit a fortune. The abuse claims, they argued, were fabricated after the arrests crafted to manipulate the system and win sympathy. If the brothers truly feared for their lives, the prosecution asked, why didn't they run? Why didn't they call the police? Why wait, plan, and kill? Both sides brought forth an army of witnesses, psychological experts, and hours of taped testimonies. The defense presented doctors who explained trauma dissociation and post-abuse behavior. The prosecution countered with behavioral analysts who claimed the brothers showed planning control and intent. Each day, headlines blared, did they kill out of fear or greed, self-defense or murder trauma response, or cold-blooded execution? Public opinion split down the middle. Survivors of abuse expressed compassion and even support, recognizing the pain and isolation the brothers described. Meanwhile, others, particularly older conservative viewers, saw the murders as a fundamental betrayal of family and morality. Across television panels and courthouse protests, debates erupted. The Menendez case had transcended the courtroom. It was now a national referendum on justice, trauma, and ethics. After weeks of testimony, the jury remained divided. Some jurors sympathized with the defense, believing the brothers acted out of desperation, but others believed a line had been crossed, that no amount of pain justified murder, and that the law must stand firm. In January 1994, The first trial ended in a hung jury. No verdict, no closure. The country was left suspended in a question without an answer. It was colder, more procedural, stripped of the emotional intensity that had gripped the first proceedings. The media still followed the case, but the public had grown weary. There were no more street protests, no heated debates on daytime television. What had once shaken the nation now barely made the evening news. From the outset, a key change set the tone. This time, the court would not allow the defense to recall the full roster of witnesses from the first trial. That included psychologists, behavioral experts, and family members who had previously offered testimony, hinting at disturbing dynamics within the Menendez household. The judge ruled that much of the earlier testimony was speculative, lacking direct evidence, and potentially too prejudicial for the jury. It was a devastating blow to the defense's strategy. The courtroom now felt sterile, more like a boardroom than a place where trauma was being dissected. There were no longer tearful relatives on the stand, no dramatic audio recordings of childhood confessions, no empathetic glances from the gallery. What remained were two things: the law and the evidence. The prosecution, emboldened by lessons from the first trial, came out swinging. They flatly rejected all allegations of abuse, calling them a convenient excuse, invented after the brothers realized the magnitude of their crime. They emphasized the lack of medical records, the absence of prior reports, and the sheer implausibility of waiting until their parents were unarmed and watching TV to kill them if their lives were truly in danger. If this was self-defense, the prosecutor asked why wait until they were sitting on the couch unarmed, unaware, then shoot them from behind. They reconstructed the crime scene in meticulous detail. Floor plans, bullet trajectories, autopsy results, and banking records showing Lyle had withdrawn large sums from his parents' accounts immediately after the murders. There was no room for sentiment, just cold, hard facts. Meanwhile, the defense found itself on the defensive. With key witnesses barred from testifying, they struggled to rebuild the psychological portrait that had once stirred public compassion. Lyle and Eric still took the stand, but this time their words were met not with sympathy, but with skepticism. Their accounts of childhood abuse and maternal neglect were now picked apart under the rigid lens of law, not belief. Another shift proved equally crucial. This time there were no TV cameras in the courtroom. The first trial had played out like a national theater every moment, broadcast into living rooms across America, but now the trial was closed off. A quiet room, no spotlight. Every sentence weighed by law, not by emotion. Outside the courtroom, public sentiment had cooled. The wave of sympathy that had crested in 1993 had ebbed. Outrage had given way to indifference. To many, this was no longer a tragic family implosion. It was just another murder case being retried. And in that stark, quiet chamber, the jury was given a task they had once failed to complete: deliver a final verdict, not based on feelings, but on facts. Guilty or not guilty, murder or not, no more gray areas, no more second chances. On March 20th, 1996, after a legal journey that had spanned 7 years, the second Menendez trial reached its final conclusion. The courtroom fell silent as the familiar names were read aloud. Lyle Menendez, guilty of first-degree murder. Eric Menendez, guilty of first-degree murder. There was no gasp, no final plea, just a sentence delivered with the cold weight of iron life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Neither brother could lift his head as the verdict was read. Lyle kept his gaze down, hands clenched so tightly they turned pale. Eric wept, but no one could say for sure whether the tears were from remorse or the collapse of hope after years of clinging to the edge. The court had rejected the narrative of abuse. Justice by the letter of the law had been served, but there would be no forgiveness. Immediately after sentencing authorities separated, the brothers Lyle was transferred to Mule Creek State Prison in California. Eric was sent to Folsom, a high-security facility. Officials made the deliberate decision to house them apart because under the law they were no longer brothers, no longer sons of Jose and Kitty Menendez. They were now classified as dangerous inmates requiring strict isolation. This separation marked the true severing of the bond that had once meant everything to them. Throughout the ordeal, Lyle had been the protector, the voice, the shield, while Eric had relied on him for strength and stability. But now each would face the darkness of their past in a solitary cell beneath flickering fluorescent lights and the echo of iron doors locking shut each night. Kitty's family was present in the courtroom that day. In a brief statement to the press, her sister's voice trembled. "I once believed forgiveness was possible, but after hearing what they did to my sister, I know I never will. They deserve to die in prison, because if they ever walk free, there is no justice." Her words reflected the sentiment of many Americans at the time. The Menendez case had become more than a family tragedy. It was a cultural reckoning between compassion and consequence. And in the second trial, the scales had tipped decisively in favor of the law's firm boundaries. Life behind bars for the Menendez brothers faded into obscurity. No more TV specials, no more front-page coverage. Every so often, a headline would surface about a prison transfer request or a letter penned by Eric or Lyle, but the public had moved on. Yet behind those steel walls, time continued its slow crawl. Lyle eventually married a woman through correspondence. Eric, too, found a form of love through letters, though they were never allowed physical closeness. They lived, but they no longer existed in the world outside. No exit, no release. Only the haunting memory of August 20th, the night they shattered everything that remained of their family. The Menendez case ended beneath the dim lights of a prison ceiling, but its echoes remained a cold blade in the consciousness of American society. Because sometimes the brightest mansions conceal the darkest shadows, and no verdict, no matter how final, can ever bring back what was lost. 3 decades after the crime that once shook America, just when it seemed the Menendez case had faded into history, an unexpected wave brought it crashing back into public view. In 2020, amid the rise of social media and a new generation fueled by curiosity and empathy, a documentary series was released online. But this time, it wasn't just about the murders. It delved into the brothers' alleged abuse, the overlooked evidence, and the cold mechanics of the 1990s legal system. The documentary quickly went viral across TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. What shocked observers wasn't just the content, it was the response. For Gen Z raised amid conversations about mental health, child abuse, awareness, and systemic justice reform. The Menendez story no longer looked like a simple tale of greed and murder. To them, it looked like the tragic collapse of 2 boys who had been silenced, and then punished for breaking that silence. Short clips of the brothers in court, trembling voices, tear-filled eyes, fragmented stories of abuse spread like wildfire. Influencers, social advocates, and even therapists began re-examining the case through a new lens. What if they were telling the truth? What if Jose Menendez really was a predator and Kitty a silent accomplice? Had America, in its hunger for justice, locked away 2 victims whose only crime was survival? The hashtag #Menendez Brothers exploded on TikTok, garnering hundreds of millions of views in a matter of months. Comments flooded in. "I used to think they were monsters, now I see broken kids. This isn't justice, this is punishing victims." A new generation untethered from the moral assumptions of the 90s began to ask uncomfortable questions. Had the truth been buried beneath a society unwilling to face the reality of abuse behind closed doors? Lyle and Eric, once among the most hated names of their era, were now being reframed as tragic figures. They became the subject of fan edits, emotional ballads, even school essays. Some viewers started petitions demanding the case be reevaluated, not to erase guilt, but to acknowledge what they had endured. Of course not. Everyone agreed. There were still sharp voices insisting they murdered their parents. You don't get to call them victims, but 2020 brought a shift. For the first time, there was no single narrative. The story of the Menendez brothers now belonged to millions, each person bringing their own lens, their own pain, their own perspective. Podcasters invited journalists who once covered the trial to reflect. Some even apologized on air for missing the bigger picture. YouTube flooded with forensic breakdowns, rediscovered letters, and case files previously ignored. Each piece felt like a puzzle, finally placed in its rightful spot decades too late. And somewhere inside the concrete walls of two separate prisons, Lyle and Eric began receiving letters from across the world. Messages of support, of empathy, even of love. They remained locked up serving life without parole. But outside, their story had been reborn, not as a footnote in true crime history, but as an echo of a society learning to look beneath the surface, to face the shadows hiding behind perfect families and gleaming walls, and to ask, did justice serve truth, or only the version of it that fit the time? Nearly 3 decades after their conviction, after years of silence behind prison walls, an unexpected flicker of hope emerged from a fragile yellowed piece of paper, a handwritten letter dated 1988. The author was Eric Menendez. The recipient, his cousin Andy Cano, now deceased. The letter had been tucked away among family belongings, uncovered only after Andy's passing. Its contents were chilling. In trembling handwriting, Eric wrote, "Dad is doing things to my body that make it hard for me to sleep. I told Mom, but she just stays quiet." There was no vagueness, no coded language, just the raw voice of a boy under 18. Speaking of physical violation and hopelessness inside his own home. The most shocking part. The letter was written a year before the murders. At the first trial, critics claimed that Eric's testimony about abuse had been concocted after his arrest as a legal strategy, not the truth. But this letter changed everything. It was real. It was dated, and while Andy could no longer speak, his preservation of the letter spoke volumes. For skeptics, it created pause. For supporters, it was the missing piece. The first tangible evidence that Eric had tried to cry for help long before bullets shattered the calm of Beverly Hills, and it wasn't the only revelation. Around the same time, in an explosive interview, Roy Rosello, a former member of the iconic 1980s boy band Menudo, came forward with a disturbing allegation. He claimed that Jose Menendez, during his time as an executive at RCA Records, the label that had signed Menudo, had raped him when he was a teenager. Roy's account was graphic and detailed. He described a corporate event hosted by RCA the moment Jose lured him to a hotel suite and what happened behind that locked door. He had no connection to the Menendez brothers, no motive to fabricate. And yet his story echoed the same terror and silence that Eric and Lyle had described years ago. Only this time, it came from an outsider with no legal stake in the case. The reaction was immediate. For the first time in years, the public began to question the original verdict, not just emotionally, but logically. If another victim had come forward with a story that matched the pattern, then what else had been buried? What if the monster wasn't invented as a courtroom defense, but had been real all along? With Eric's 1988 letter and Roy's sworn statement, a legal door creaked open. New attorneys for the Menendez brothers filed motions for case review, urging the courts to reconsider the conviction in light of newly discovered evidence that could have changed the original outcome. This wasn't about overturning the past entirely. It was about demanding a trial that included the full truth. The chances were slim. The American justice system rarely reopens cases after final sentencing, especially decades later. But for the first time, Lyle and Eric weren't fighting alone. They had documents, they had voices, and they had a generation behind them not arguing that they were completely innocent but insisting that they were once children no one listened to. In that faint light, the Menendez story pulsed back to life, not as a true crime headline, but as a hard lesson. The truth doesn't always surface on time. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to be seen. By 2023, more than 30 years after that fateful night in Beverly Hills, the Menendez case had returned once more to the heart of American public discourse, not because of a new trial, but because of a deeply unsettling question: if they were truly victims, can society forgive them? Fueled by fresh empathy from a younger generation, the release of new evidence, and an explosive abuse allegation from another victim, the Menendez brothers' story, once considered closed, burst open again, but this time not in court. It unfolded across podcasts, television roundtables, social media platforms, and even inside law school classrooms. One side argued passionately if Eric and Lyle's accounts were true, if the 1988 letter is indisputable proof, and if Jose Menendez was not only abusive within his family but toward others too, then his death was not just a crime, but a consequence. That the brothers were not motivated by hatred or greed, but by a crushing sense of fear and isolation. To them, this was no longer about legality, but humanity. Now is the time for justice to include compassion, they urged. But prosecutors and many legal scholars refuse to budge from the stance held since 1996. No one has the right to kill, not even if their past is filled with pain. To them, law must stand firm. They argued that if society began validating murder through the lens of trauma, where would the line be drawn? Who decides how much pain justifies violence? How does justice survive if emotion rewrites the rules? The debate went beyond legal technicalities. It struck at the core of ethics, morality, and societal responsibility. Sociologists pointed out that the Menendez saga exposes an uncomfortable truth. Domestic abuse thrives behind the mask of picture-perfect families, and that the justice system, especially in the 1990s, lacked the tools or willingness to protect children trapped in homes ruled by fear and silence. Psychologists offered another lens. If Lyle and Eric were indeed victims who were never offered healing, never heard, never saved, then is a life sentence truly justice, or is it a second punishment, first by their family, then by the state? On TikTok and YouTube, content creators began drawing comparisons between the Menendez trial and more recent cases where abuse survivors were met with support and protection rather than prison sentences. Many asked if this case happened in 2023 instead of 1989, would the outcome have been the same? And if the answer is no, what does that say about the justice system of the past? Inside the prison walls where Lyle and Eric continued to serve life sentences, nothing had changed. The doors remained locked, the visits remained limited, the sentence stood firm. But outside, the conversation was evolving, and for the first time in over 3 decades, the Menendez brothers were no longer viewed solely as cold-blooded killers. They had become the center of a question that cut deep. Where is the line between victim and perpetrator, between justice and forgiveness? And perhaps the more haunting question, does society have the courage to look into the shattered mirror that is the Menendez family and see its own reflection? More than 30 years after their sentencing, the lives of the Menendez brothers behind bars no longer made headlines. The frenzy faded. What remained was time, quiet, unrelenting time under the flickering lights of prison cells where the past could not be erased, but no longer defined everything. Amid the nation's ongoing debate over guilt and justice, Lyle and Eric chose a different path to live in atonement, not endless appeal. Housed in separate prisons, they no longer shared a physical journey, but remained bound by an internal one. A journey of 2 men who lost everything, now quietly trying to reclaim whatever humanity they could. In a rare interview, Lyle said, "I don't want to be defined by one night. I want to be seen through the whole of my life, my mistakes and my efforts to make things right. No longer pleading innocence, no more courtroom defenses." Both brothers now dedicate themselves to helping others, especially young inmates with histories of abuse, neglect, or trauma. Lyle created a support program inside his facility, organizing group discussions and coordinating with volunteer therapists. Eric teaches literacy classes to undereducated inmates and collaborates with outside organizations to raise awareness about domestic abuse, something he says no one should be forced to endure in silence. Both have married while serving life sentences. These relationships, built through letters, conversations, and time, not physical contact, are rooted in empathy, not infatuation. These women aren't the so-called killer groupies the media loves to sensationalize. They are people who believe in redemption, who believe that no one is born a murderer. Life inside prison isn't romantic. It is monotonous, stark, sometimes unbearable. But in the small moments, receiving a letter, helping a fellow inmate through depression, organizing a discussion group, they found reasons to keep going. There are no more cameras, no more spotlights, just two men alone with memory, regret, and slow-moving years. Although no formal appeal is currently active, both brothers, through legal representation, still hold out hope for one thing: a new hearing one, where previously excluded evidence like Eric's 1988 letter and Roy Roselow's testimony might finally be heard with fairness and without prejudice. They are not asking for immediate freedom. They are asking to be seen as human beings who were once broken, not merely the cold-blooded killers etched into a courtroom's verdict from a different era. On Eric's cell wall hangs a handwritten quote, one he's had for years. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to live anyway. And perhaps that's what the Menendez brothers are doing now. Not demanding, not denying, not defending. Just two men who once fell as far as it's possible to fall now, learning how to survive the darkness while guarding a flicker of light. Whether it is the light of hope or the glow of remorse, it is for them the only thing left. In May 2023, a long-awaited legal motion was filed that could have changed the trajectory of Lyle and Eric Menendez's lives. A petition to vacate their convictions, citing two key pieces of new evidence: the 1988 letter Eric wrote to his cousin Andy Cano and the public accusation by Roy Roselow, was officially submitted to the California courts. It wasn't a plea for a pardon. It was a demand: re-examine the case fully, fairly, and without the bias that had defined it 3 decades earlier. The petition spanned hundreds of pages, meticulously laying out the previously overlooked indicators of abuse, inconsistencies in prosecution testimony, and perhaps most importantly, how the justice system of the 1990s lacked the tools and the willingness to protect victims of familial abuse the way today's courts are beginning to. But just days after the motion was received, the district attorney's office responded with resolute skepticism. Yes, they admitted the 1988 letter was authentic, but they argued it didn't prove that Jose Menendez had abused his sons to the extent that would justify murder Roy Roselow's claim. They dismissed it as unverifiable, pointing out that it surfaced 30 years later with no independent corroboration. To the prosecution, it wasn't compelling enough to unravel 2 guilty verdicts handed down by 2 separate juries. Moreover, they warned reopening the Menendez case could set a dangerous precedent that anyone convicted of a violent crime could later use emotional evidence to challenge clear legal outcomes. In their view, a conviction should not be undone simply because society's emotions or perspectives have shifted. The court has not yet ruled on the petition. The case remains under review, a phrase that in the American justice system can mean months or even years of waiting. The law moves not with public sentiment, but with paperwork, and paperwork moves slowly. Meanwhile, society finds itself bitterly divided once again. On one side, there's a rising chorus of support driven by Gen Z, trauma-informed advocates, and survivors of abuse, demanding a retrial. Online petitions have gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Letters have been sent to the governor of California. Social media campaigns continue to go viral. To them, justice is not static. It must evolve. Reevaluating a case after 30 years is not weakness. It's a mark of progress. But on the other side, a quieter yet firm faction insists. The law must remain a bedrock, not swayed by TikTok trends or emotional waves. They argue the facts haven't changed. The brothers purchased weapons, reloaded during the attack, staged a cover-up. To them, that's not trauma, it's premeditation, and no letter or late-breaking testimony can erase that reality. In the middle of this legal and moral crossfire, the truth remains suspended. Old wounds have been reopened, painful but necessary. Yet the legal system remains stuck paralyzed between outdated procedures and a new cultural understanding of abuse. Lyle and Eric remain behind bars, still waiting. But this time they're not just waiting for a court date, they're waiting for a societal reckoning. A moment when the world must decide, can we revisit the justice of the past and admit that sometimes a legal verdict may be correct, but still not truly just? 35 years after that fateful night in Beverly Hills, the two sons who once shocked America remain behind bars. Lyle Menendez, now in his 50s, hair-graying gaze heavy with age. Eric Menendez, quieter and thinner, leads a solitary existence in a separate facility. They are still waiting, not just for forgiveness, not merely for a new trial, but for something far more elusive, a society willing to reconsider. For decades, they have been branded murderers. Their names became synonymous with youthful greed, entitlement, and cold-blooded violence. But now, a different set of questions has begun to rise. Not only in courtrooms, but in the hearts of those who followed this case through the years. Were those two boys truly paralyzed by fear? Or did they carefully orchestrate a crime and hide behind a well-crafted plea for sympathy? Were the claims of abuse the heartbreaking truth or a strategic manipulation of public compassion? We may never have absolute answers, because this is no longer just a legal case. It's become one of the greatest moral tests of modern justice. Can justice exist at the intersection of law and empathy? Can we forgive a killer if we know he was once a desperate, voiceless victim? The aftermath of the Menendez murders is like a shattered mirror. Look into it, and everyone sees something different. Some see two remorseless killers who bought guns, loaded them, and executed their parents before pretending to weep on camera. Others see two terrified boys trapped in a gilded prison of silence and trauma, with nowhere to run but into violence. Justice in this story is not just a courtroom sentence, it's a mirror held up to our society's understanding of trauma, redemption, and the limits of mercy. Lyle and Eric are no longer pleading for sympathy. They are not demanding immediate release. What they ask quietly, persistently, is to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be heard as more than the worst moment of their lives. In an age where conversations about trauma, child abuse, and institutional failure have become more open and nuanced, the Menendez case no longer feels like a relic of the past. It feels like a warning. Sometimes, in seeking justice, we forget to look at the human being behind the act. There is no single answer to this case, no final ruling that can silence the deeper questions. Instead, we are left with one piercing thought. If it were you, if you had to look into Lyle and Eric's eyes, would you condemn them? Or try to save them? And perhaps that's why the Menendez case endures. Not because it's sensational, but because it forces all of us to examine our own beliefs about right, wrong, and what it truly means to call something justice.